Welcome, everybody, to Leading with Emotional Intelligence, presented by the Wisconsin School of Business and the Center for Professional and Executive Development. Good afternoon, I should say, to everybody. My name is Jeremiah DeGullen. Before I get started, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Sadie Cernico.
Sadie. Hi, everybody. Hello, my name is Sadie, and thank you guys for joining us today. I work in alumni relations at the Wisconsin School of Business, and it's our mission to keep you informed and connected to WSB, and we do that through things like events, networking opportunities, communications like our Update magazine, and professional development opportunities like this webinar. Before we get started today, I just wanted to mention a few upcoming opportunities that we have this summer. So we have our WSB In series where we are coming to different cities regionally, and on June 27th, we're going to have our WSB in MPLS event in Minneapolis. So if we have any Twin City Badgers on the call today, we really hope to see you there. Again, that's on June 27th. And then also keep a lookout for our Milwaukee Badgers. We'll be coming back for WSB and MKE for our Milwaukee event sometime this August. Date still pending, but we'll have more information on that soon. And lastly, I just wanted to let everybody know that Homecoming Bash this year will be on October 7th, and we'll start selling tickets to that event this summer, a little bit later in July. So keep an eye out. You can find all of those events at business.wisc.edu/alumni. So I think that's it for me. I'll pass it back to you, Jeremiah.
Well, thanks, Sadie. Sounds wonderful. Lots of great things coming up. Today's webinar is also brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development, commonly known as CPED. CPED offers programs and certificates that will give you the modern, relevant skills needed to advance in your career. All of our programs offer interactive learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please join us online at uwcped.org. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask during today's webinar, you can submit those questions using the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. We'll pose questions that are submitted during the Q&A period at the end of today's webinar. I also want to mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent in the coming days. And now I have the privilege of introducing our speaker, Tracy Nelson. Tracy, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah, and hello, Badgers out there. It's really a pleasure to be with you today talking about a leadership competency that can really have a big impact on your career and your personal success. So you've heard an introduction from Sadie and Jeremiah, so I'll be very quick and brief in sharing my intro. But I've worked in a variety of industries over my career, from healthcare to manufacturing, financial services, and more. I do currently teach at the Wisconsin School of Business, taught in both the MBA program and the undergraduate programs in management and human resources. And currently I work with clients around the world on their leadership development, team development, and talent optimization needs. And I love what I do. So today's emotional intelligence topic, I believe, is one of the most important competencies, again, that you can work on as a leader that will really serve as the foundation for a lot of your other leadership skills that you need to build to again, really be effective in your career. So whether we're informal leaders who maybe don't have manager or leader in our title, or we are directly leading teams, EI or EQ, again, is going to be one of those foundational skills that you will really want to work on cultivating to help strengthen all of your leadership effectiveness skills. So let's go ahead and jump in. I know we've got hundreds of you on the line today, but we still want this to be interactive where you'll have the opportunity to weigh in. So I'm going to ask you all to open our polling site. There's a couple of ways you can do that. If you've got a smartphone with you, you can use the QR code reader, and that QR code will pop up directly to the polling site. You just agree to participate. And then we will, if you would keep that open throughout the entire webinar, we'll be doing several different polls today. Another option is you can pull up this polling site via a browser. So you would go to pollev.com/aspiretalent, and that will also allow you to participate in the polls. So I'll give you just a minute to do that, but we'll let you know also that whenever a polling slide goes live, you will still see that little tiny QR code and that address as well. But do recommend you go there and go ahead and keep that polling site open today so that we can hear from you also throughout the program. So we'll do a test poll, and there you go. You're doing it already. All right, so I asked where you're joining us from today. So I see a lot of folks in the Wisconsin area, Midwest area, but it looks like we've got badgers are out there everywhere across the country today. So very happy to see that. Great. We've got some folks, somebody in Alaska, California, Florida, Texas, Northeast. Look at you go. Wow, we're filling that map. Badgers are everywhere. I love it. All right, so you guys, you've got this polling down, doing a great job. So let's jump in. We're also going to use chat today. There's going to be some times where I ask you to weigh in with your thoughts in the chat box as well. So I will ask you to how you would describe this concept of emotional intelligence. So don't worry about phrasing it perfectly, but I'm guessing you've heard that phrase before, emotional intelligence. If you could, please go ahead and weigh in. How would you describe emotional intelligence, or EI or EQ? Any thoughts on that? There we go. Thank you. Ability to understand and manage your own emotions. Great. Ability to communicate and operate with empathy for others. Thank you, Jacqueline. Excellent. Nadia, good. Ability to understand and manage your own emotions and others. Excellent. All right. We've got some good, yep. Recognizing your own emotions, how that impacts others. Good. Being able to manage emotions in tough circumstances. Excellent, Heidi. Thank you. Understanding that you control your response, being cognizant of body language. Yeah, ability to get in front of your emotions. I like that phrase, Jen. That describes it well. Okay, good. So you guys have a sense of what emotional intelligence is. And here's how I describe emotional intelligence. It's our ability to be aware of our own thinking patterns, mental models, and behaviors, to manage and adapt our reflexive or instinctive responses and actions to more effectively understand, connect with, influence, and build constructive relationships with others. So it's a long definition, but emotional intelligence encompasses a lot of things. So EI is really about how we think and behave, as well as how we act on those thoughts and feelings as we interact with others. And there's several different emotional intelligence models out there. Many of you might have heard of Daniel Goleman, who has a popular model. Dr. Travis Bradberry is also a thought leader in this space when it comes to emotional intelligence. But so there may be different models or ways of viewing EI, but if you look at them closely, really all the concepts and principles of emotional intelligence are fairly agreed upon regardless of what model you might be using. Today, I'll share a little bit more about those components that make up emotional intelligence and some ideas for how you can continue to build your EI skills as a leader by focusing in those areas. So when people hear the term emotional intelligence, it's often thought of as soft skills. So we tend to term hard skills as those technical or role business specific expertise and knowledge. So for example, if you're an accountant, it's your actual accounting skills. If it's your ability to do budgets and spreadsheets or forecasting. If you're in marketing, it's your marketing knowledge and expertise. So we often hear the term soft skills to identify the skills that tend to fall in those interpersonal skills categories, the people skills. Again, how you communicate and interact with others, how you navigate your relationships. And research already shows us those interpersonal skills can have a big impact on our career success. So in the chat, I'm going to ask you to take a guess about what percentage of one's success do you think is attributed to hard skills versus soft skills? Hard skills. Okay, good. Thanks for taking a shot. Yep, 33. 80, 20, 20. Yep. Good. Very close. Yep. Excellent. So many different people have done research on this. It all, to some degree or other falls about to this breakdown of about 15% of one's success can be attributed to hard skills. About 85% of our personal success can be attributed to those soft skills, those people skills, those interaction qualities. So many of us know people who are really good at aspects of our job, but they're real stinkers to work with, right? Somebody might be an awesome salesperson and rock all of their quotas, but maybe they're not very good to work with, right? They don't get along well with others. So when you think about it, people can be technically competent, but might really struggle with some of those interpersonal qualities that really are quite important to career success. So we're living in a VUCA world. It was a term coined by the military in the 1970s, and it was used to describe the fog of war, or that chaotic feeling of being on the battlefield where everybody's moving, everything's moving around you. It kind of feels volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So even before the pandemic, it felt like the world was speeding up and changing rapidly. There were a lot of new emerging technologies, changing customer preferences, changing demographics, globalization, the regulatory environment was changing. So we've been living in a VUCA world for a while, and we see changes happening faster. So I love this slide. It's an illustration of how long it took each product to gain 50 million users. We can see the airplane at 68 years. Then we watch it speed up through the decades. Took about 22 years for cell phones to hit 50 million users, or 12 years, Facebook 3 years, Pokemon Go 19 days. So it's interesting to see the world really is moving quickly, and forward-thinking organizations are working on building emotional intelligence skills in their employees and leaders to strengthen their workplace relationships and to foster greater innovation and agility. And we know that technological disruption is driving an increased need for emotional intelligence skills. So when you think back to our hard skills versus soft skills slide, digitization, machine learning, the rapid advancement of AI means that a growing percentage of those hard skills may be supplemented by the power of artificial intelligence. However, those soft skills then, how we as human beings interact with each other in order to effectively get things done in the workplace, those become even more important. And McKinsey anticipates between now and 2030, the need for those social skills, those EI skills, are really going to increase dramatically and grow at a much faster rate. So the fourth industrial revolution is really what this period has been termed. And a recent Harvard Business Review article basically says, it's called the EI advantage. We're going to send that out to you, that corporate cultures that lack EI are really becoming a major liability as business environments change. So when we fast forward 100 years from now and machines are running assembly lines, not to mention a whole bunch of other things they might be doing, it's leaving humans to focus on the roles that really require that social and emotional mastery. So it said that the Industrial Revolution required strong workers, the information age required knowledgeable workers, and the future age of work is going to require emotionally intelligent workers. So as the technology becomes more sophisticated, those human skills like empathy and compassion and the ability to create effective dynamics across teams becomes even more important for organizations. So EI skills account for 80 to 90% of what's required for exceptional performance. So I want to take a moment and differentiate between emotional intelligence, or EQ, and IQ and personality. So I'm going to ask you to drop your thoughts in the chat section again, if you will. Which of these three factors do you believe are fixed versus which ones do you feel are responsive to change, or you have the ability to cultivate it? Any thoughts on that? Take a shot. Which of these factors? Oh, I'm showing you. I'm showing you already. Yeah. Okay. So personality actually tends to stay relatively fixed. So people often challenge that. Your innate personality style tends to stay relatively fixed. However, as we grow and mature and we get out there into our roles, we are able to adapt our style. So we might, for example, be naturally more introverted and reflective. But we found that we need to take steps to connect and build relationships in order to be successful at work. So we can change our behaviors, but our innate style preferences tend to stay pretty consistent over the course of our lives. Also our IQ, again, people say, well, wait a minute, the more skills and knowledge I gain, I'm getting smarter, right? Well, your IQ is actually a measure of your ability to learn. And believe it or not, that also stays fairly consistent over the course of your life. So you will gain additional skills and knowledge and experience. However, your IQ tends to remain relatively stable. EQ, however, is very responsive to change. So there's really no known connection between IQ and EQ, but EI is a set of skills that can be grown and cultivated through awareness and practice. So that's good news for us. So let's take a look at how we can cultivate it. So the reptilian brain is said to control all of our instinctive or impulsive thoughts and actions. So when we look at our brain, the brain science really drives a lot of our behavior in the workplace. And it's often referred to as the triune brain, the three parts of the brain. And that reptilian complex that you see, it's that instinct, those impulses, kind of those thoughts and actions that are hardwired into us, instinctive. The limbic system is where our emotions are actually generated, and it interprets our emotions. And the neocortex is more of our executive functioning. It's where we ponder, analyze, make decisions, have more of our rational thoughts. So there's varying theories about how the brain works, but it's generally accepted, again, that there's that reptilian instinctive area, which is called the lower brain, that emotional next layer, the limbic system, and then the higher brain neocortex with reasoning and logical thought. So brain science actually shows us that EI can be developed. The path for EI, it starts in our spinal cords, it hits that instinctive reptilian brain, it then goes through our limbic system where our emotions get generated. So when it feels like sometimes you have an immediate emotional reaction to something before you can step back and be rational, that's actually 100% correct. That's exactly what's happening. The emotion is generated first, and our rational mind is a step behind and catching up. So EI is really this ability to strengthen that connection between our rational brain and our emotional brain. I've been really fascinated with the concept of neuroplasticity. About 16 years ago, I was a healthy, happy career person, and out of the blue, I had a major stroke, and they only gave me about a 15% chance of being able to return to full functioning. I was having a lot of trouble with my speech. So long story short, I've really defied the odds, and I've learned a lot about how the brain functions and this concept of neuroplasticity. And we know that our brain has the ability to reroute and grow new connections as we learn new skills. And it's a lot of neurons line that path between the emotional side of our brain and rational side of our brain. And as you can see on the slide, we can grow new branches up to 15,000 per brain cell. So our brains are really powerful, and we can strengthen that connection between our emotional and rational brain to cultivate better emotional intelligence. So again, yeah, there you go. Amygdala. Somebody's familiar with amygdala. Good job. We will talk about the amygdala. Real quick, drop for me in the chat. Why is it especially important as a leader for us to cultivate our emotional intelligence skills? Why do you think? I mentioned emotional intelligence really serves as the foundation for a lot of there you go, trust. Good. Good. We're responsible in part for well-being of others. Excellent. Yep. Neuroplasticity, set the right culture. Love it, Amy. Thank you. Christopher, more effective leader. We need to interact with people, build connections, help set the tone. Yeah, good. Excellent. So I mentioned earlier, EI is the foundation for so many other leadership skills, servant leadership. Excellent. So think about it. You have to be, in order to be a good coach, you have to have emotional intelligence. You have to have self-awareness, the ability to connect with others. Your ability to lead through times of change and disruption, got to have good EI skills for that. Your ability to motivate your team and your team members. Your ability to handle difficult conversations or to address performance issues. Or your ability to influence and work effectively across departments or to manage up. all of those things require strong emotional intelligence skills. So that's why I call it the foundational leadership skill that really is at the base of cultivating all of your other leadership effectiveness behaviors. So I mentioned we'd talk about a model. Travis Bradberry's model basically talks about emotional intelligence in a couple different ways. He talks about personal competence being made up of self-awareness and self-management, and social competence being made up of social awareness and relationship management. So let's dig into each of these, and here's some tips for how we can cultivate our emotional intelligence in these areas. So self-awareness, it's the level of accuracy in which you see yourself relative to how other people might see you. So if you have a high level of self-awareness, that means you have a fairly accurate view of yourself that's consistent, reasonably consistent with how others might see you. You might be very aware of your strengths and some of your development areas. So it's things like being aware of my own communication style preferences, my understanding and acceptance of different styles and perspectives, or my mental models, biases, and perspectives. So a mental model is how we view the world, how I personally view the world. That is my mental models. And for example, I might have a mental model around people shouldn't ever bring their cell phones to meetings, they're too distracting. Well, does everybody share that mental model? No, some people don't think anything of it to bring their phone to a meeting. So when you hear yourself thinking in terms of shoulds and shouldn'ts for how people behave, people should do this, that person should have done that, you're really operating from your own mental models and how you view the world, your perspectives. So Aristotle said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And I really think self-awareness is, again, when we talk about emotional intelligence, that's where it starts, is our ability to be cognizant of our own thoughts and feelings and patterns in our thinking. And we really like to think of ourselves as logical, rational creatures, but we know our brains often make stuff up. We have to be careful as our brains can play some tricks on us. For example, we have blind spots. We have unconscious bias. We have times where we see what our brains want us to see, where we might screen out information that doesn't jive with how we see the world and really reinvent incoming information so that it justifies or substantiates our viewpoints and our mental models. So we know that our brain can play some tricks. So take a look at this optical illusion. Most people would say these circles look like they're moving. They are not moving. That's an example of a brain trick, how we're perceiving something. So here's another one. This one's one of my favorites, and I'll ask you to do this with me. So what you're looking at, if you're looking at the whole screen, is you're seeing pink, probably seeing a circle with pink dots and a plus sign in the middle, and you're probably seeing one green dot going around the outside of the circle. Now I'm going to ask you to focus all of your attention on that black plus sign in the middle of the circle. So look straight at that black plus sign. And as you look at that and focus there, what you're probably going to notice is now all the pink dots go away and you're just seeing one green circle go around. Now, if you switch your focus back to the whole picture, you should see the pink dots again. Just so you know, I'm not pulling any funny business and making any changes on the slide. I'll give you a minute to kind of shift your focus back and forth on your own time so you can see how just where you're focusing changes your perspective on what you're seeing. Optical illusion. So the self-awareness component of emotional intelligence, a big part of this is our ability to get into the state of metacognition. So metacognition is higher order thinking. It's from the root Latin word meaning above cognition. So when we think about metacognition, it's thinking about one's own thinking. It's my ability to stand above myself and observe my own thinking patterns. That is our ability to get into that state of metacognition. Some people are better at it than others, but it's a skill that can be cultivated. So metacognition is really key to building our emotional intelligence skills. It helps us become self-aware of our thinking patterns and our derailers. So recognizing our derailers is important. Those are things that get in the way or serve as barriers to us being our best selves and operating in an emotionally intelligent way. One of those things that can be a derailer is that we sometimes tend to create our own facts. So the stories we tend to tell ourselves about what we are seeing when we're observing an event. Some of you might have heard of the ladder of inference. If not, it's one of my favorite concepts because we do this all the time as human beings. And if we become cognizant and get into metacognition, we can realize when we're doing it and interrupt behavior. So it basically means that when we observe an event, we tend to observe the facts, we start to selectively pay attention to them, we start to add meaning, we start to make assumptions, draw conclusions, and we then start to create beliefs and then take action on those, and it can become a reflective loop. So let's take a look at an example, because I think this is really powerful example of ladder of inference. So remember I said earlier, I have a mental model, or I don't really, but let's say I have a mental model around people shouldn't bring their cell phones to meetings. And let's say I'm in a meeting presenting my idea to the project team, and I see that John's looking at his phone and he's fidgeting in his seat. Well, I start to selectively pay attention that John offered no ideas. He didn't make any eye contact with me and the rest of the team. I might start to assign some meaning to that John doesn't like my idea and he isn't engaged in the team project. I might create some assumptions that he doesn't pay attention to what I have to say and he treats my ideas like they're not important. And I start to draw the conclusion that John doesn't respect me, doesn't want to be on my team, and he thinks he could do a better job leading this project than I am, and he's trying to undermine my leadership. So what I observed was he was looking at his phone and fidgeting in his seat. The stories I started to tell myself as I went up the ladder eventually created a belief that he could do a better job leading this project and he's trying to undermine me. Then my brain's going to selectively look for all the evidence that John is trying to undermine me, right? And I often take action on that then and decide I'm going to ignore John in the team meetings, pay attention to the other members and see how he likes that. Well, the reflective loop is what happens then when I start ignoring him in the meetings. How engaged is John? Not very. So we know that our brains do this. We're human beings. We can't stop ourselves from doing this. It's how our brains work. But what we can do is recognize when we're starting to go up that ladder of inference and challenge ourselves. So what was it that I actually observed? So what is fact from fiction? What is the story? What did I actually observe versus what is the story I'm telling myself about what I observed? So again, you're not going to be able to say, oh, okay, I'm just going to train myself not to go up the ladder of inference. Good luck, folks. It's how you're wired. It's how our brains work. But you can train yourself to pause and say, wait a minute. Yes, how can I focus on the facts and reality versus what is the narrative that I'm creating around what I'm seeing? So we do this. So being cognizant of it, really self-aware, metacognition, what am I doing here, is really an important first step. Another derailer is imposter syndrome. And again, we can use metacognition to recognize when we're feeling this and to challenge our brains to separate what's real from the story that we're telling ourselves. So imposter syndrome is that feeling of self-doubt, feeling like a fraud. I'm going to be found out. I'm not as good as people think I am. I'm not as knowledgeable. And ironically, the original study was done in 1970. It was done with high achieving women who had trouble attributing their own success to themselves. About 7 out of 10 people tend to experience imposter syndrome. And what I think is so fascinating about the research is that it tends to be high achievers. People who are really high performers tend to suffer from imposter syndrome and have that be a derailer even more often. So they say about 7 out of 10 experience it. Let's do an anonymous poll here. How many of you would say there's times where you've experienced imposter syndrome? Afraid of being found out, not as good as people think I am, kind of having those self-doubt feelings. Yeah, see, this is what I see more often. I do this poll a lot in training and I see, 90-something% of people usually say, yeah, I've absolutely had those moments where I felt like an imposter. So again, it's that self-checking. It's that understanding that you're doing it. So people say, well, how do I not get it? How do I not fall into imposter syndrome? Again, I will tell you, good luck with that. That's how your brain works. It's not about stopping yourself from doing it. It's about being aware of when you're doing it, and then being able to self-manage that by challenging your thinking. What is the story I'm telling myself here, right? Some other things that can get in the way are cognitive biases. They're accepted as things that just kind of make us human. They're everyday systematic errors in our thought processes that impact how we live and work. So I'll mention a few of them very quickly, and I'm going to guess that you're going to notice that you might use one or more of these or fall into this trap. So again, these are some other derailers, but you will receive a resource that has more information about these cognitive biases. So fundamental attribution error just means we tend to assume other people's actions are less affected by the environment and more affected by their personality traits. So for example, we might see somebody on the street who has an angry expression at that moment, and we might tend to think, oh, that's an angry person. Or another example of this is we may think actors who portray a certain personality or character are really like that in real life, right? So that's a fundamental attribution error. The next one is bandwagon effect. It's that tendency for people to kind of follow the leader or to adopt certain perspectives or behaviors simply because other people are doing it or because the opinions are popular. So we tend to adopt them too. The halo effect is our tendency to judge someone based on our first impression. So there was an old adage that you have about 10 seconds to make a great first impression, and that's somewhat true. We make quick decisions about whether we feel positively or negatively about someone, and then it can be difficult to break that initial bias. False consensus is our tendency to see our own behavior choices and judgments as common and appropriate. So I'm the normal one, right? That's false consensus. I'm the normal one. Everybody else is weird. Availability bias, the tendency to use information that comes easily to mind, often in decision making. So for example, this is the information that I have, so this is the decision that I'll make. So here's the available information, so here's my decision, not necessarily looking beyond that. What information don't I have? What other information might be helpful to me in making this decision? Availability bias. Dunning-Kruger effect. This is when people with low ability, knowledge, or expertise in a certain area tend to overestimate their ability or knowledge in something. So I think I'm an expert, and that clouds my judgment. And another one, there's like 50 cognitive biases, so I'm only hitting a few common ones. But confirmation bias is that tendency to see new evidence or information as confirmation of my existing beliefs or mental models. So I said earlier, that's kind of how the brain's wired. I'm going to look for information that confirms the beliefs that I have about John, who's trying to undermine my leadership in the project meeting, right? So I'm going to get a new piece of information, and I'm going to figure out how that supports a belief that I have. Yeah, so these are some common cognitive biases. Again, there's about 50 of them. But why is it important to know about these? Because we fall into these traps, and they affect our decision making, they affect our relationships, they affect our ability to make good decisions, and again, make good connections. They affect our own behaviors and actions. So again, the key is getting into that state of metacognition and saying, where might I have a bias in my thinking pattern here? So I'm going to do the next poll. I'm just going to ask you any of those that you feel like you might experience most frequently. Take a shot at it. Okay, there we go. Yep. Confirmation bias. Yep. All right, good. So pretty much, yep, all over the board. Absolutely. So we all probably do use all of these, right? But we may find ourselves falling into certain thinking patterns more often. So your EI self-check on self-awareness is really just being aware of your own thinking patterns, reflective questions, being able to pause and say, again, what are the facts versus what's the narrative that I'm telling myself, that ability to get into metacognition, even my ability to have some knowledge about my own personality style. There's a lot of tools out there, like DISC is a great tool for understanding personality styles and communication style preferences. So is MBTI. One of the tools I really like is Leadership 360 assessments, where you'll see that there's a list of competencies or behaviors, and then you self-rate And then other people like your peers, your direct reports, your boss also rate you on these different characteristics or competencies. So these can be really effective tools in becoming self-aware. We could do an entire webinar on using assessments to validate different emotional intelligence behaviors. But I wanted to at least show you a couple of ways that people can gain some insight into, again, communication style preferences, behaviors that we might use, overuse, or underuse. Self-management is that just our ability to manage our thoughts and behaviors. And we have some things that get in the way of self-management, some common defense patterns or mechanisms. So the key to increasing your self-management is to reflect on some of these. So denial or avoidance, refusing to think about or deal with something, displacement, uploading our frustrations and emotions on a different target than who it's meant for. We have a bad day at work, we come home and blast our husband or wife, right? Projection, where we project our own feelings or shortcomings onto other people or situations, and we might overlook our part to own in it. Or rationalization, where we're just attempting to justify and explain our own unconstructive behavior by blaming someone else or something else. So we do tend to fall into patterns like this. And again, it's our ability to go, wait, metacognition here. How can I be self-aware of what are some of the unconstructive behavior patterns that I tend to lose, and put mitigation in place. So for example, let's say somebody says something to us in a meeting that sets us off. So I know one of the things that's kind of a trigger to me is if somebody says something bad about one of my employees, I tend to instantly feel defense of my employee, right? And we think stimulus, someone says something, response, I get angry. But we can remember that in between stimulus and response, we have a moment to choose a constructive response, right? It doesn't mean that we won't get angry. And here's where I think people sometimes struggle. We're not going to be able to train ourselves not to have an emotional response. Your reptilian brain and your limbic system, things are going to happen. You're going to feel an emotional response. But the key to emotional intelligence is feeling it. And instead of having that instinctive reaction and blasting somebody with an unconstructive behavior, it's going, oh, that triggered me, that set me off. I don't feel good about that. I'd really like to blast them. But to be a more effective leader, I'm going to remain composed. I call it face of grace. You may feel the anger on the inside, but you're still going to choose a constructive response as you deal with that situation. So it's about learning to manage your triggers or your ECRs, your emotionally charged responses. And that first step to controlling the ECRs is to think about who are the people or situations that tend to lead me to get triggered? What are some things that cause me to respond emotionally? And do I notice any patterns in that? So like I said, I already know about myself that I tend to get defensive about my employees. So my awareness of that means that I'm going to do a better job when somebody says something and I get triggered of being able to go, hold the fort. I don't like that, but I'm going to self-manage and not blast them. I'm going to have a more constructive response to them. So managing those triggers is really important. And I love this phrase, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. So what happens when we feel criticized or attacked? And somebody mentioned it earlier in the chat. They mentioned the amygdala. So we can go into amygdala hijack where sugar and fats and adrenaline pour into our system. Amygdala hijack is that reptilian part of our brain where if somebody criticizes us, our brain still works the same way it did in historic times where the threats were things like we were out hunting and gathering for our family and a bear came out of the woods and our reptilian brain kicked in. It's our fight or flight response, right? So all these things start to happen in our body to prepare ourselves for fight or flight. Well, the same function of that area is still there, but the threats today are different. We get our food from the grocery store, right? But the threats today are maybe somebody yelled at us and we start to go into amygdala hijack and we go through all these physical reactions where heart rate and breathing increase and perspiration and salivation. The key points on there to pay attention to is our ability to apply reason and logic can drop by 75% when we're in that state. So If you've ever tried to have a rational conversation with somebody who was in amygdala hijack, really emotional, really angry, you've probably realized that that didn't go so well. They're not in a place, their rational brain is not kicked in, their reptilian brain is going crazy. And it can take about 20 minutes to recover. So, when they say sometimes it's good to pause, count to 10, walk away, that's because it's allowing some of that amygdala hijack energy, negative energy, to dissipate. So your EI self-check for self-management is thinking about things like, what are some of the strategies I can put in place when I do feel some of these emotional reactions? When somebody triggers me in a meeting, or when somebody criticizes me and I start to feel my face get red or my heart rate increase, what are some of the mitigation strategies I can put in place? I'll tell you a real quick story. Years ago, I was working for an organization that was going through a merger, and somebody from the other organization in her department needed help, and I sent one of my employees over to help for a whole week. Well, I got an email that was very critical of my employee, and you already know I got a trigger around that. And I was triggered by the email, and I sent back a really sarcastic response. This was many years ago. And then I went home that night and slept on it. And I woke up the next day and I went, oh, Tracy Nelson, you were not your best self. And I did not start off on a good foot with this other leader. And I had to go apologize. I mean, it wasn't horrible, but it was definitely not my best self. But I, in that moment, said to myself, I am never going to send another email when I'm in a highly angry, volatile, emotional state. Now, as a leader, I know that sometimes we have to handle things in the moment. You can get better at self-managing those emotional, volatile emotions. But whenever I can, if I've been triggered, I pause, I walk away, I write the email and wait till the next day to send it. And some of those mitigation strategies I've put in place have been very, very helpful in managing that. So you're checking your mindset whenever you're in a situation like that. Are you operating out of my way? I'm right, you're wrong. My version of the truth is right. I need to win, you need to lose. Or are you approaching it from, I've got something to learn. I might not have the whole story. People are doing their best. We can have a mutual outcome or benefit. So checking your mindset, again, it's a metacognition skill. So I think those personal components of self-awareness and self-management are really important. The other two I still want to mention. So social awareness is those somatic, the gut feelings that come from that amygdala. It's those sensations that something feels off. It's your ability to read the room. It's your ability to pick up on cues that provide you with information about another person's communication style preferences, how they might be interpreting what you're saying. Many of you sometimes might have walked into a room with a team that's not getting along, and you can just kind of feel the tension. You're using your social awareness skill of emotional intelligence. So we won't spend very much time on this one, but the way you would self-check your social awareness is just, again, those reflective questions. So how well do I do really listening to others, or do I tend to really be always thinking ahead to the next point I want to make? Do I tend to read the room when I walk into a meeting, or am I just in my own world? Those are some of those self-check. How well am I using social awareness? And the last component we'll touch on briefly as well is relationship management. Relationships are built on micro moves. So they're small actions and behaviors that don't seem to be a really big deal, but they impact the overall relationship. Do I take time to say good morning to people, right? Do I take time to recognize or acknowledge or appreciate when someone does something for me? Those are the little things that tend to build relationships. And there's varying research on this, but a lot of it is about 7 positives to be able to have a negative. And even though we look at conflict as bad, another derailer is having a conflict as bad mindset. We certainly don't want personal attacks on the right side where it's destructive, but we also don't want artificial harmony in our relationships where we're just pretending everything's fine and we're seething beneath the surface because there's things that need to be addressed and we haven't had the courage to address them. So conflict is not bad. We want healthy conflict. We don't want artificial harmony. We don't want personal attacks. We want to be able to have authentic conversations. And we may sometimes need to deal with people that get angry, but one of the things that's helpful to know about when we see anger, think of the anger iceberg. So the feeling we tend to see is anger, but what we know about anger is that it's a secondary emotion. There's typically a primary emotion underneath the anger that's driving it. So if, for example, we have to give somebody some difficult feedback that they made a mistake, we give an employee feedback that they messed something up, they might get angry and upset. But what we don't see under the surface, what are some of those feelings that could be driving that anger? Well, they might be embarrassed that they made a mistake. They might be worried about their job. They might be feeling insecure in their role. So the emotion we're seeing is anger, but anytime you're seeing somebody angry, stop and ask yourself, what could be the primary emotion driving the anger? Underneath that anger, let's say I ask my husband to go out on date night, Saturday night, and he doesn't want to go. He's going with the guys. I might get angry. What might the emotion be underneath? Well, maybe I'm sad. I want to spend more time with him. So I might be reacting out of anger. Anytime you see anger, ask yourself, what could be the primary real emotion that's driving the anger that I'm seeing? And that can help you manage that. So your EI self-check when it comes to relationship management is asking yourself, where are my current relationships? Are they where I want them to be? What's my part to own in them, right? Because if we're always waiting for somebody else to change their behavior, how much control do we have over that? None, right? The only thing we control is our own behavior. So when we reflect on our current relationships, whether it be at work or home, one of the key things we can do as we reflect on each one is, what is the current state of this relationship? Is it where I want it to be? If not, what am I willing to do and change to get it there? So we'll wrap up with 14 EI strategies for greater influence and credibility. First, seeking input and perspective from others, demonstrate curiosity, get in that mindset of being a scientist, showing genuine interest in other people. Challenge your own thinking patterns, get into that metacognition. Where might I be experiencing cognitive bias as I deal with people each day or as I make decisions or make connections? Framing language matters. We want to shift from I'm right to offering our views and using phrases like, I wonder if, in my experience, I've seen this, we may want to consider, what are your thoughts? So if you get good at using phrases like that, they go a long way in building those connections and helping people feel valued and respected. We want to demonstrate authenticity, say what we mean what we say. We want to fight the over-attachment to look good, look smart. We all have it. It's a human disease. We want to look good. We want to look smart. And as a result of that, it's hard for us to be vulnerable. But we want to fight that over-attachment and be so not so attached to looking good, looking smart. We want to stay in what we call sage brain versus saboteur brain. We want to short circuit that amygdala or lower brain emotions like fear, anxiety, anger, feeling victimized, and pause and say, how can I shift into higher brain here? How can I shift my rational or logical side in and get out of that amygdala? We want to seek and be a good receiver of feedback. We want to look for that nugget of truth. People might not always deliver feedback in the best way. They might not pick the best time. They might not pick the right words. But I always say, whenever we're on the receiving end of feedback, look for what is the nugget of truth in what they said. When you mess up, own it. We want to take accountability for our actions. It's okay to not be perfect, right? Our real power comes from authenticity. None of us is perfect. And we want to learn to give an effective apology when necessary. 3 parts. I made an error, I made a mistake. I apologize. How can I make it right? A lot of us have a lot of trouble saying, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I apologize. How can I make it right? When you're navigating a difficult conversation, kind of sit in that observer seat, metacognition. You want to create some space between yourself and that situation. And I always say, ask yourself the question, how would my best self handle this? How would my best self handle this situation? In conflict, look for where that other party may be at least 10% right? Don't disregard everything they're saying. If you're in conflict, what parts of what they're saying could be 10% right? That helps you get into that scientist brain. What can I learn from this? And if you're on the receiving end of anger, pause and reflect on that anger iceberg. What's that underlying feeling driving the anger? Because that's the real feeling you want to deal with to be effective. Think of relationships as bank accounts and make deposits. So I mentioned that 7-to-1 ratio of positive to negative. Think of filling people's cup, taking time to say hello in the morning, good morning, recognizing people, saying thank you. It's those little micro moves that really make a big difference in our relationships. And last, reward yourself for your constructive behavior. So we want to create dopamine anchors around positive habits. Here's what that means. Our brains crave dopamine. It's a reward neurotransmitter in our brains. And if we give ourselves praise or do something, so let's say we're trying to cultivate a behavior that I'm going to pause and not have a negative reaction if somebody triggers me. First time I do that, I'm going to self-congratulate, right? And I might go treat myself to a Starbucks or, whatever it is, whatever behavior I'm trying to cultivate, give yourself some positive reward. Your brain will start to crave more of that. And I've used that one more point. We'll go to our wrap up here, but I've used that with employees. So I had an employee who, when she went in meetings, she talked all the time. Nobody could get a word in edgewise. She was so passionate. She'd talk the whole hour. I praised her one day because she took a moment to stop and ask for somebody else's opinion. And when we got out of the meeting, I said, "Oh, Sue, I really liked that when you asked Carrie for her thoughts. That was great for you to get her input." Well, guess what I got more of in the next meeting? And I praised her again. Was able to totally change behavior through praise, right? Everybody craves it. So that's kind of your 14th last strategy for greater influence and credibility. As we wrap up, sometimes people ask me, how do you measure EI? There are tools out there. One of them I use a lot in my work is the EQI 2.0. That is a self-assessment, but the EQI also comes in a 360 where you might ask your direct reports, your boss also to rate you on different EI behaviors. So again, as I mentioned, we could spend an entire hour on assessments and instruments and diagnostics, but I did want to at least mention that yes, EI is measurable and there are tools out there, and this happens to be one of my favorite. So for additional learning, you're going to get some resources. This webinar today was recorded and a link will be sent out, as well as some supplemental resources on cognitive bias and a couple of articles on emotional intelligence. So look for that coming out in a few days. I feel like you got an appetizer today, guys. I could talk about emotional intelligence for days, but hopefully we gave you a good synopsis of what is it, why is it a key important skill for your career, and why is it going to become even more important as the world moves forward and technological disruption continues. And we've given you some ideas for self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. So with that, we will open it up for Q&A. I will also invite you. I love connecting with Badgers. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I invite you to do that. Just look for Tracy Nelson, SPHR, CPDD. All right. And with that, we'll open it up for some Q&A. Jeremiah?
Yes, thank you so much, Tracy. That always learn something new from you, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. And for all of our participants, if you do have any questions that you would like to pose to Tracy, if you just click on that question and answer box at the very bottom of your screen, we will take those questions now. Tracy, do you happen to have any recommendations for additional learning, books that individuals could take a look for?
Yeah, absolutely. So Daniel Goleman is an author that does a lot with emotional intelligence. I can't think of the names of the books off the top of my head, but I'll send them out when we share the resources. I'll send a reading list of some additional emotional intelligence books. Dr. Travis Bradbury was the model that we talked about today. He also has some excellent books on emotional intelligence, and there will be some articles that we'll send out as well.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracy. Here we have a question. How do I stop or interrupt the negative emotions when I feel them so I don't act on them in a way that damages my relationships?
Excellent. That's an excellent question. And so you may recall we talked about how you're really not going to be able to stop yourself from feeling negative emotions. So you're going to have them, folks. You're going to get triggered. People are going to tick you off. You're going to get angry. So your reptilian brain is still going to have all of those impulsive, instinctive reactions. Your limbic system is going to create the emotion around it, that it stops right there. And that's when you kick it to your higher brain, your neocortex, your rational brain. So it is that it all keeps coming back to that key skill of metacognition, being able to get into metacognition, think about your own thinking and go, okay, I feel this, and I could just act on it by blasting somebody or saying something snarky or, being mean back to them. Or I can feel all of this and go, okay, I feel it, but I'm going to self-manage and choose a constructive response. So if your relationships are not where you want them to be, because maybe you don't have good self-management, then you have to put some prompts in you have to recognize, when have I been triggered? What does it feel like in my body when I've been triggered? Do I feel my heart increase? I tend to feel my face get red. I go, oh, I've been triggered. I'm having an emotional response. I need to recognize that and then say, okay, I feel this, but I'm going to consciously choose a constructive response instead of a destructive response.
It's a good point. Thank you,
Yeah.
Tracy. Yes.
Breathe, observe.
Do you have any perspectives on emotional intelligence in a more remote working environment post-pandemic?
Yeah, that is again, we could do an entire half day on that, but you're right. It makes it more challenging to connect, right? It makes it a little bit more challenging to read the body language. Essentially if I had to boil it down to what the tip is for demonstrating EI in a remote environment, it's almost that you need to exaggerate all of the skills. So your self-awareness skill, your social awareness skill, if I'm trying to read the room, and I'm in a virtual meeting, I'm going to be extra cognizant of what I'm seeing for body language, because I'm only going to have the face to look at, right? So you're really just exaggerating what might be a little bit easier in a in-person environment.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tracy, which of the 4 components of emotional intelligence that you mentioned do you think are most important for a leader to work on?
Yeah, we spent the most time on it today because I think it's the most important one. It all starts with self-awareness, right? Because I really can't work on my relationship management skills if I'm not self-aware of how my own thinking patterns and my own behaviors are impacting my relationships. So that personal competence category of emotional intelligence is where, I would put the most emphasis as a leader. Again, it gets back to how I've shared that we can't really control other people. We can only control our own thoughts and behaviors and actions, right? So I would start with self-awareness and say that really is the most important one, because the other ones really build off that. Your ability to self-manage comes from your ability to be self-aware of what you're feeling when you've been triggered, and self-aware of, okay, this is how I've been triggered. This is the real feeling, and this is how I'm going to choose to deal with it. Everything's built on self-awareness. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm seeing one if you don't mind me taking one in the chat. EQ for an employee that's working for someone that has no or limited EQ. How do you work with them? As a leader, coaching questions. Again, every one of these questions, I wish we had another hour, but the quick answer to it is you use coaching questions that force them to reflect. So if, for example, they've been on a project team, they haven't been working, so what's gone well here? What do you think the greatest opportunities were for you to make that relationship more constructive? Or where do you feel like it went astray? Is there any way you feel like you could have handled that differently? It's coaching questions, open-ended questions. It's making people reflect on their behaviors, just like what you're doing to yourself. You're kind of self-coaching to try and increase your own self-awareness. Oh, the leader has no EQ, not the employee. Again, you can control your own EQ, not those of others. To try and make it a really short tip with the time we have left, I would say it's through questions. It's through reflective questions with the leader.
Wonderful. Well, Tracy, I see we are at time. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us today. We really appreciate you stopping by and joining us. And again, thank you to all of our attendees and the Wisconsin School of Business for their continued investment in our lifelong learning journey. So with that,
I'm going to add one more thing. Based on the questions that I'm seeing in the chat, I'm going to throw in one more resource for you. I've got the mother load of awesome coaching questions. I'll make sure that gets sent along as well.
Always adding more value. Thank you so much, Tracy. Well, with that, have yourself a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.